Hello and welcome to the New Moon Tarot reading for the new moon that fell yesterday, and that was the 21st of January at 8:53 p.m. UK time. It's been about 3 months since I did the last reading. If you were listening to the last reading that I did in October, I did talk about not being able to do the readings as regularly as I have done, simply because I am now working full-time. But I will try and bring them out as often as I can, hopefully quarterly, if not more than that. And all big plans to release a reading over the Christmas holidays at around about the end of December just went poof in a whiff of smoke, because I was travelling internationally and came back and promptly got really quite ill. So that put paid to those plans. But here it is now, the third week in January. Is this the fourth week now? And this is your new moon reading, which is really from yesterday evening UK time to over the next 4 weeks, and then beyond that as well. And of course, because one of the cards is the foundation card, there's also an element of the past coming into the reading as well. So for those of you who know this very well, you can skip through to card number 1, and I will do, there'll be a link where you can do that, or a time marker where that's possible. And for those of you who are continuing to listen, welcome back, and those of you who are new to the reading, welcome. The way that I read is very simple. There are 3 cards, very rarely a fourth. Sometimes I have a feeling there won't be one this month. And there is always the same positioning for each of the 3 cards. Namely, the first card is the foundation card, the second card is the current weather, and then the third card is the tool or agency card. The foundation card is something that you are bringing in to the current reading, the current energy of the month, that is significant. It's either caused in some way, directly or indirectly, what is going on in your life, or it's had an impact on it, or it in some way equips you for what is going on, and is normally really quite, because it's foundational, really quite a significant part of the reading. Sometimes even more significant than the main theme, the card number 2, the weather card, simply because it's something that's been with you possibly for a very long time, and in some way is then representing itself. Perhaps in a different form, perhaps in the same form, for you to look at along with the theme. And then, of course, the second card being the theme card, that is one, it's a significant aspect or happening in your life in the next 4 weeks, and having an impact beyond that. It doesn't necessarily have to be big in terms of taking up time and space, but it may be small and significant, something that you perhaps only even notice when you're looking back, though sometimes it will present itself quite obviously and you'll know exactly what's going on. And then the final card is the agency or tool card. Because the foundation card is something that you really have no control over to a certain extent, because it's happened in the past, and because the theme in some way, very often archetypal, is something that you can't really avoid, or you can't stop happening. The tool or agency card is a way of harnessing or mitigating whatever it is that's going on. It's where you meaningfully, personally connect with the story that's being woven by the first 2 cards. So I am now going to go on to the first card, the foundation card, and we will see how the reading unfolds from there. Card number 1, foundation. And I turn the cards over one at a time, so I don't know what they are. I haven't sneaked a peek. The other 2 cards will remain a mystery until I come to them. But this is card number 1, foundational, and that is the Queen of Wands. Now, it's always interesting when a court card comes up, because I think a lot of people get confused as to how to approach court cards. And some readers get confused as to how to read court cards, and I was certainly among that number at the beginning of my reading career. But I think one of the reasons why we struggle with court cards sometimes is for the very reason that they are very often mirroring aspects of ourselves. And sometimes taking a good look at ourselves is very difficult to do. and in fact underpins a lot of psychological theory and thought, the inability for us to take a clear look at ourselves. If you are the kind of person who identifies immediately with the Queen of Wands, the message may be quite simple and straightforward. But what I wouldn't discount immediately is that that identification, that immediate identification, may also be masking a form of denial about something else that's going on. It's the easy road to take, and then you can just bypass a lot of things that may actually be incredibly useful, if perhaps more difficult to look at in terms of the Queen of Wands. So one of the things that I think we're going to be unfolding here is the Queen of Wands, not only in her sort of more light state, but also her shadow state. This is not going to apply to everyone. It may be very straightforward. It may just simply be being you. This is you. This is you showing up in your life, perhaps for the first time. It could also be mirroring somebody else in your life, not necessarily a woman. The Queen of Wands is a quality rather than a person. It is an aspect of personality. It can refer to a person in as much as could be a mature woman, somebody in her, say, mid-40s and above. But it's not always limited to that. We have every single one of the 16 court cards in us, and they express to varying degrees. Sometimes, a lot of the times throughout the day, we may identify with one of them more than others. It's always worth paying attention to the ones that we identify with, as I was saying. Sometimes we identify so readily that we fail to look at the nuances behind that. And sometimes we identify with one of them to the detriment of the others. And it's always worth reminding ourselves that we are all 16 of them. So if there are some that feel incredibly absent, they are there, but they are simply not in your conscious awareness. And it is worth bearing in mind that they will still be active in one form or another, in myriad forms actually, myriad expressions, but not necessarily in a conscious way. But the Queen of Wands herself, this is foundational. So this is something that has happened in the past. It may be the recent past. It may be an encounter with a part of yourself. As I said, it may be that you suddenly have felt front and center of your own life. It may be that you are faced with somebody who has that Queen of Wands quality about them. And that person may also be mirroring the Queen of Wands in yourself. So it may be the recent past. It may be you all along. It may be that you are a fire sign. It may be that the Queen of Wands for me is leonine, but definitely associated with the fire signs. But she is the watery aspect of the fire signs. So there is that watery aspect too, and it's worth bearing in mind that it's not just all fire. It's also an emotional sense of engaging with one's creative spark. Wands are to do with that creative energy. It's the energy that precedes thought, it precedes emotion. It is the energy that courses through everything. It is the energy that you can feel in your body. It is referred to often as libido. I think our everyday understanding of libido is very limited. It's normally down to sex drive. Yes, libido is behind sex drive, but it's actually the drive to life. It's the drive to existence. It's the drive to creativity, not just the drive to procreativity. And it is the igniting factor in our lives. Nothing happens without the wands. The Ace of Wands is not the first card in the deck for nothing. And it is the ignition that starts everything off. So the Queen of Wands very much embodies this energy, but in an emotionally intuitive way. In her lighter aspects, in other words, the aspects that most of us want to identify with, the ones that we would prefer to have, she is highly creative. Probably there is an element of the erotic around her. You can certainly see that in this card. She is dynamic. She is assertive. She is mercurial in a way. I know that is normally associated with swords, the mind, Mercury being of the mind, but mercurial in a way of a sort of fieriness, quick movements, quick-witted, and she is very much here a sort of smouldering, sultry but very direct woman. She's not some kind of coy batting her eyelids or eyelashes at people sort of with a slightly lowered head. She is sultry in a very direct way. There is a very masculine aspect to her as well. And the Queen of Wands is also really, if you think about it in terms of everyday expressions of the Queen of Wands, she is the artist, she is the creatrix, she is the rebel in some ways. She doesn't give a shit about what people think of her in some expressions of that are positive, and also not giving a shit about what people think is not only a positive quality. There is something about here being so driven and so fiery and so single-minded that actually you end up being beholden to nothing and no one, and there is a sense of the weight of a certain responsibility that I think brings balance back into relationships and how one relates to the world and oneself. The Shadow Queen of Wands, well, she's fire, so the Shadow Queen of Wands can burn everything to the ground around her, including herself. She can use that fire either as a creative force or a destructive force. She will very often be burnt herself in the process. If she isn't, and she's the lone survivor in the conflagration that's happened around her, well, then it's quite a lonely business. She is the person who, if somebody tries to get close, burns them in a way. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something incredibly destructive, but it may be that she's too hot to handle. And when I say she, I'm talking about the archetype, so this can apply to anyone. It's a very nice defense to be too hot to handle, because while it also leaves you alone, it does leave you in a kind of safety, a sense of safety. It's an isolated safety, and there are things, you pay for that in one way or another. But what it does do for the Queen of Wands, who is working out that shadow side of her, working from that, is that it in some way protects her from something, whether that is pain, whether it's intimacy. Those are one and the same thing very often. And it also allows her to hide behind a certain kind of creative flair, but there is a sort of lacking in depth to that creativity. It's not totally rooted in to the fullest expression of who she is. There is a sort of dilettanteism to the Queen of Wands very often when it is, or she is, expressing in a shadow form. So one of the things that the Queen of Wands has written on her card, which I think really ties into a lot of this, is the idea of self-knowledge. I think when we become aware of ourselves, whether that is a slow, gradual dawning of awareness, or whether it is a flash of insight that then, may stay, may disappear for a while, may come back again, disappear, come back again. There is that idea of knowing oneself, to know when it is that we are expressing ourselves as the Queen of Wands in a more holistic way, or where it is that the Queen of Wands is kind of driving us from an unconscious perspective. It's also worth bearing in mind that this may be referring to someone else as well. So it's where we are interacting healthily, where there is a healthy relatedness to the Queen of Wands, or where we might be getting burnt by somebody who is in our lives, or by a quality that we tend to experience in different people, but it's the same quality, it's a similar thing. If you're one of those people who is on the receiving end of a kind of shadow Queen of Wands quality, not just from one person, but from many people, it's worth bearing in mind then that very much is a mirror. Those qualities are coming in to mirror something in you as well, which is why the Queen of Wands can be very rewarding, immediately rewarding, in as much as there's a sense of warmth, of recognition. She is also one of those ones, as I was saying earlier, that it's worth looking at a little bit more to see whether that warmth of recognition and the immediate, oh, I know what this is all about, this is fantastic, this is who I am, whether that's actually masking something else that's going on as well. So bear in mind the idea of fire, the many forms of fire, and the many ways that we interact with fire and how fire interacts with us. The ones that feel pleasant and the ones that feel not so pleasant and the ones that feel deeply unpleasant. And where it is that we experience fire in our lives and how we relate to that, whether it's something that we are aware of, that we are becoming aware of, or whether the idea that fire that burns us and others is something that really doesn't exist on our radar. And if so, maybe we're lucky that that isn't the case, that we don't experience that, or maybe that we've done a lot of introspection and we've reached a place where we are aware of that and we have been able to work with that fire in a healthy way. And sometimes maybe it's where we burn and are burnt and we aren't aware of it yet. This is foundational. This is something you're coming in with. It's the one card where you can look back and go, this has happened. And so even if you're not immediately cognizant of what it could mean, the meaning is there. In other words, the theme card and the tool card are things that are coming up. The theme card may be present in some form or other, but the foundation card is the one that we can look back at. And of course, that's a blessing and a curse because we can find it and identify it. We can't stop what has already happened, but we can then start working with things moving forward in a more considered, in a different way, or at least with some increased awareness. And increased awareness is something that really is an incredible gift. The awareness itself is the start of things, but without the awareness, nothing begins. So, which is a very wands kind of energy anyway. So having awareness itself can sometimes feel painful at first because we can suddenly start to feel aware of something even while knowing that we haven't been able to stop it or we've let something happen many times over. So it's a painful awakening, but it is the beginning of something that can be incredibly fruitful. And now we're going to move on to the second card, and this is the theme card. So as I said, this could be a theme writ large in your life. It could be in your life only. It could be in the lives of those around you. It could be something that's in the world that's going on that's very obvious, but in some way that macrocosm will also hold within it the microcosm of the theme card. And the Queen of Wands is going to be instrumental in this in some way. And we will see how that is when we turn over the theme card and start to explore it. And it is the High Priestess. Now, what's interesting about the High Priestess next to the Queen of Wands is that immediately with the Röhrig deck, you see that there is a certain mirroring and then there isn't. So you've got the fieriness of the wands, you've got the coolness of the moon. The High Priestess card being the card that is associated with the moon and not the moon card itself. So the High Priestess is the moon. So you've got the sun, the fire of the Queen of Wands, and then you've got the moon of the High Priestess. You have got two women who are head on facing us, except the Queen of Wands is at the top of the card. The face of the High Priestess is at the bottom of the card. The Queen of Wands' eyes are open and her finger is there on her chin as if she's contemplating something. The High Priestess is contemplating something, but inwardly her eyes are closed. It's almost as if the energy of this month is go within, go within, go within. I'm going to go straight to the writing on the moon card because there is something here that's quite interesting. You've got here access to intuitive powers, healing, independence, inner balance, increased self-confidence, wise woman, balance and harmony, and I can't read the other one. I'm wondering if it's in German. But there is that idea of self-confidence, whereas we have the idea of the Queen of Wands as self-knowledge. Now, the Queen of Wands and the High Priestess then work together really well because there is this very even while the Queen of Wands is very, she is interacting with us with her eyes open, there is, and she's fiery, there is a sense of containment about her. And there is also a sense of containment around the High Priestess. It's almost as if this fieriness of the Queen of Wands then meets the, in some way, the limits or limiting energy of the moon. That in some way, that fieriness is about being, it's about being brought inside, being contained, being directed inwardly, so that there is a deeper connection, not only with one's own self, there's definitely going to be the idea of the embodiment, which is around the Queen of Wands, but also a connecting in with a wisdom that is in the body, but not necessarily always of the body. The idea of intuition, the idea of that kind of bodily sense of wisdom that is there, is something that we can feel quite palpably, but it doesn't, nobody really knows where it comes from. And for me, it's almost like a transcendent sense of wisdom that is filtered through the body. The body is the instrument. It is the way that it communicates this sense of wisdom. But the wisdom, to me, also feels cosmic, in as much as there is a voice or a sense about it that is not just limited to us, and it's certainly not limited to our conscious minds, our limited bodies. So the High Priestess is really that knowing, that she stands at the threshold of the spirit world and brings messages from the spirit world down into the human world. She is an archetype. The Queen of Wands is a kind of archetypal personality type, but the High Priestess is a pure archetype. As one of the major arcana cards, we may feel that we embody the High Priestess at times, but we really cannot embody any one of the trump cards. We can't embody the major arcana. If we feel that we have, then that is what's known as inflation in Jungian terms. There is a certain kind of vanity that is involved in believing that we fully can embody any of the energies in the card, or that we have them solved, that we have in some way understood them, and that we have access to them in a way that is all-encompassing. To do that is really to limit the major arcana cards quite severely in terms of their expression. Their expression goes above and beyond anything, including the ability to describe it. But also it is to limit ourselves in a way, because what it does is, again, it shuts down the argument, it shuts down the ability to explore what ifs, and also it shuts down the ability to exist alongside a sense of mystery and not knowing. And the High Priestess, really, in terms of mystery and not knowing, is the perfect card, because it's that moon, it's that lunar-like feeling to it. It is that liminal world between what is conscious and what is unconscious, if you think of it in religious terms, between God and man. But also with the moon, there is that idea of the dark side of the moon, and the fact that we don't have access to that. The High Priestess is both the light side and the dark side of the moon. She is not fully knowable. We can think we've got her and we haven't, because that is the vanity of building a tower up to God, so that we, that in some way there is a language that is entirely divine and we have access to that. There is the understanding that we are human, we are limited in terms of everything. Our lifespan is limited, our bodies are limited by our skin, our awareness is limited, our awareness of ourselves is limited, our awareness of what goes on in the darkness, not only in ourselves, but in the interconnectedness of all things, is limited. The High Priestess represents the mystery, and she sits at the threshold of that mystery, and so in some ways she is a mystery too. So how do we interact meaningfully with a theme that contains not only a major arcana card, which in and of itself remains outside of our full grasp, but really one of the more enigmatic ones that is right at the beginning of the journey through the majors. So things have yet to coalesce into form. The High Priestess is 1 foot in this world, 1 foot in another world. What is it that this represents in terms of a theme? And I think that what it's going to represent in many instances is that idea of the emergence of something that is not going to be palpable. In other words, you're not going to be able to measure it, you're not going to be able to see it, you're not necessarily going to be able to feel it. But the emergence of something from within, and it may also feel like it's not just coming from within, it might be emerging from somewhere else, that feels like the truth, but it's not a truth you can prove, because the High Priestess isn't interested in proving anything. She simply knows. Now, we can't, as I said, embody the High Priestess, so we can't just simply sit there and say that we know and believe that that's the whole story. There will be a part of us that knows. There will be other parts of us that we are not aware of, that may not necessarily fall in line with all of this. It's really quite difficult to explain this, but I'm hoping that I'm communicating the gist of this. But it will be a sense of something that feels like truth. But it is going to be, and while it is going to be noticeable, always with the High Priestess, there is a sense of the intangibility of it. That if you try and grasp it and make it so, if you try and ask it to prove itself or to make itself more known, it will evade and elude. The High Priestess is a very subtle sense of knowing, in as much as the message may be direct, but to demand more proof of that message is sometimes really to shout into the void. There may be a very clear message, but it may not say why. It may not explain itself in any way. It may be incomplete. It may simply be a sensation. But it's going to be something that comes through your own intuitive capacity, whether you know that you have that or not. And if you've dismissed yourself and said, oh, I'm not an intuitive person at all, I don't quite know, well, it's possibly just that you haven't yet understood how your intuition speaks to you, or you've been listening to it all along. It's just that you've been thinking it was, that it had to show up in another form. So there is an emergence of some kind of sensational information that is there, but it is going to ask you to in some way work creatively with it. Now, the Queen of Wands and the High Priestess can do this really beautifully, but they can also work a little bit like oil and water. So there is going to have to be a sense of being able to work with some, and this word comes up a lot, humility, with both the High Priestess and the Queen of Wands. The Queen of Wands is really the ideal tuning fork to pick up what the High Priestess, that archetype, is bringing. But the problem with the Queen of Wands as well, as what we were saying, is that she's very fiery, and a tuning fork needs not to be interfered with. If you've got a tuning fork, you can't, if you touch it, it stops. If you don't listen to it carefully, it's not going to work for you. And the Queen of Wands' fieriness needs to be in some way channeled and worked with in a very conscious way to bring through the High Priestess. It's not there to make judgments or to eclipse or to make something grandiose out of it, but she is there to work and to create. So, for example, if you see the Queen of Wands as, say, the witch archetype, there are good witches and there are bad witches, if you look at fairy tales. And the good witches are the ones that are the conduits for wisdom. They understand that those powers are not coming from them. They understand that they are connected into some kind of power, and they are the channels. It may be quite impressive to look at from the outside, and that's where the inflation could come in with that idea of the witch archetype, because people can either laud that kind of energy and make it all about the person, or they can fear it. But the witch just simply gets on with the business of tapping into her intuitive abilities to bring through that whatever it is, that form of magic. And I say that in inverted commas because it may seem like magic, but to her it's just simply the way that she works. So there is that idea of that kind of witch. And then there is the idea of the witch that is either punished for what she is doing, or that she is vengeful or controlling, or seeks to subvert something for her own gain. If you go into fairy tales, you can see this. You can see the fairy godmother, who's a kind of witch, who enables, who is there as an assisting power but works magic. Or you could see the witch that imprisons Hansel and Gretel and fattens up Hansel so that she can eat him, so that she can consume that life force from him. There is a way of working with the high priestess energy that really calls for awareness and discipline. And the bad news with that is that the awareness and discipline when you're working with lunar energy is that there are going to be things that are going to be out of your line of sight that then may in some way surprise you or trip things up. And I think that one of the ways of working with this idea of the dark side of the moon is to assume that you don't know everything. And that's one of the ways of working with it. But the good news with working with this lunar energy is that you can actually be incredibly receptive to very useful information that comes out of the collective depths, or that comes from your own bodily wisdom, without needing to dissect it too much, without needing to question it or ask it to reveal itself more or to show you proof, without needing to explain it to other people. Now, when you don't explain things to other people, there are a lot of people who then demand that you do, or they write you off. And this is where the Queen of Wands comes in. That idea of, look at her. Just imagine being faced with that if you're asking her to give you more evidence because you don't believe her. That look that she is giving us there is very clearly a woman who is in charge of her own, I was going to say in charge of her own destiny. That's a bit that's a bit elevated. But in charge of herself. She doesn't need to, it's that idea of not giving a shit, but in a good way, of not minding what other people think, of not needing to explain herself too much. Sometimes people want you to explain yourself, not because they want to know more information, but because they simply want to exercise some sense of power over, that they want to catch you out, or they want to feel like they are the ones with the upper hand. And the Queen of Wands here, who is really not in the mood for explaining herself as far as I can see, retains that sense of personal authority because she is not giving it away. She's not giving away her power. And I know that that's a very oft-used phrase, but I think that there's something here about the Queen of Wands in her brightest and lightest sense of that containment, that where she is not just for anyone, she is for herself. She doesn't need to explain things because along with the High Priestess, when that's working, she knows. And again, this is for everyone. It is not just for the women listening. This is the Queen of Wands energy is apparent in every single one of us. There is a sense of knowing, and the High Priestess is really the origin of the message. The Queen of Wands works with it. So given the fact that the Queen of Wands is foundational, it's almost as if you have spent some time in your life, whether it's a long time or recently, being able to, or having the opportunity to be able to not only understand your own sense of working with energy, or working with your own creativity, or directing your attention or focus, but also being able to contain it so that there isn't a sense of inflation, that there isn't a sense of ego coming in, or control or power over. And then the High Priestess energy comes in, and then that aspect of the Queen of Wands will know exactly what to do with it. Of course, This is in its lightest sense. The Queen of Wands can work very effectively as well with the High Priestess if she wants to wreak damage, if she wants to enact revenge, if she wants to get in control, if she wants to have things go her way. That can also work too. So it really is about your own experience of the Queen of Wands and how she then interacts with this emerging sense of information. And remember, this information is not going to be flying across the sky, being dragged by an airplane. It's not going to be. It's not going to be something necessary. Well, it may be, and in which case that's very fortunate, and then that's incredibly clear. But sometimes, or probably most of the time, it will be a subtle but distinct sense of, okay, this is something that's worth paying attention to. Sometimes it will show up, it will pop up maybe in a kind of synchronicitous event that then just brings it out from within, that you see a headline in a newspaper or somebody says something that sparks something. But those things that are happening, they kind of happen independently of the message, which is what synchronicity is about. It's an acausal connecting principle. In other words, the medium that you get the message isn't actually the message itself. It's not actually, it is simply sparking something that was already in you that you can listen to. And this is going to be in the form of information. This is information that is going to be something that you then have to work with. The shadow side of the High Priestess is the Cassandra complex. And the Cassandra complex is that feeling of not being believed, even when you have what you know to be true, in that you have something that is true for yourself, and then you take it to somebody and they don't believe it. Now that may be something that's that has happened to you, that there may be something that's true for you, and it may be that your experience has always been that when you've tried to say something, that it is discounted immediately. But this is a pattern. The Cassandra complex is as much as it's the voicelessness of knowing something and yet not being heard. And if that's the case, then the Queen of Wands is really your ideal ally in this, to be able to be heard, and possibly not by the person that you've been keeping on going to, but actually to go somewhere else to be heard. But the Cassandra complex is also, in a similar vein, trying to bring some very important information that's not necessarily about you, but about something else that's going on and not heard. And so again, the Queen of Wands is, to go back, that's foundational. It's how that message is conveyed, and also using creativity to convey that message. And that creativity may, as I said, be as simple as just simply deciding to do something different and not relay the message in the same way or to the same person in some way to be noticed. So that experience of being Cassandra, you can look it up and see what that means. It's not going to happen to everyone. It will. It may happen to a few of you, but the High Priestess shadow side is that idea of the Cassandra complex of knowing something and not being able to get it to the right people, and of being discounted. It's very much along the parallel of the witch who is burnt at the stake, which is more of the territory of the Queen of Wands. The High Priestess as well, in her shadow state, is about thinking that there are messages from on high and disseminating this as if it's some kind of gospel, when it simply isn't. It's simply that the own person's unconscious speaking to them. And that is normally in the territory of when one identifies too fully with the archetype. That's inflation. And with inflation comes a sense of unreality and a sense of being closer to the gods than one actually is. What one's closer to is one's own unconscious and the things that reside there. So it takes some, again, the word humility coming up to work with the High Priestess, and doubt, questioning things. It's not really about demands for proof, but rather not just swallowing things hook, line and sinker. The Queen of Wands is apt to do that when she's in her shadow state. But when she's not in her shadow state, she is a canny customer. Those messages that come from the High Priestess, the Queen of Wands is one of those archetypal personality types that can keep things real, that can in some way apply that sort of light from the fire over this thing that's emerging and say, let's have a look at this more closely. Is this really true? And that humility then of the Queen of Wands in her more balanced state is one that's integral to being able to work with whatever information is coming out from the High Priestess. And then we go on to the final card, which, I mean, we've done a lot of agency and tool cards, really, in terms of the Queen of Wands. It's how you work, how the Queen of Wands works with the High Priestess. But it'll be interesting to see what the third card is and how it can work in a complementary way to the energy of the High Priestess that is coming out now. So this is the third card. This is in some way how you interact more meaningfully. It's the way that you do that. It's where you can apply something. And that is the Six of Wands. So we have another Wands card here. So we've got two Wands card, one Court, one Minor Arcana that are flanking the High Priestess. And I like the way that the Six of Wands sort of mimic the two that's in the High Priestess above the moon, and the six wands are above a source of light, which is the sun. So let's unpick this in terms of what it is that gives you agency in the moment during this time that the High Priestess is coming to the fore this month. The writing that I see immediately on the Six of Wands is, well, of course, victory, and that is used across many different tarot decks, not just the Röhrig. So there's that idea of victory, and then success and clear breakthrough. And what I see here as well is combination of power. Now that's interesting because we've been talking about combining the Queen of Wands with the High Priestess, and I think that what the Six of Wands is really doing is underpinning that. It's to engage with the energy this month in a Queen of Wands way, in a kind of senior court fashion, to be able to clear the way in something. Now, it's interesting to me as well that you've got this road. It's implied that there has been a block of a wall in front. It's interesting that you've got on the left-hand side that wall is almost like a profile of a face. And I wonder who that face is. And it also stands out because the other two actual faces are head-on. So we've got this profile here. And that road that continues on up to this this hill in the distance with this light source above it, which is almost a reflection in sort of a smaller reflection of the light source that is above it. And this hill is one that appeared in the Two of Wands. And it was the start of the journey, crossing the threshold of the two wands to wend the way up towards this hill with a citadel on the top. And obviously at some stage in the journey, because that road was hidden from view as it sort of ducked down over the other side of a hill before it crested again, there's been an obstacle. There's been an obstacle in some form that has felt insurmountable. But what's interesting is that there has really not been an option to turn around and go any other way. As you can see here, it has been simply about staying and waiting and biding time. And then in this moment, there is a breakthrough, quite literally. The metaphorical breakthrough is really depicted in a very clear form in the Six of Wands. And then the road then stretches out again. There's no guarantee of where that road is going to go because you can't see it going all the way up to the hill. It obviously changes direction, but for the time being, there is more road to go on. You are now freed to continue the course that you've been going down. And also it doesn't look like a course change, if you see what I mean. It's almost as if the obstacle itself was the challenge, and then being able to work with that challenge in a way that probably required patience. And whatever it was that you did, the effect was that wall then disappeared. It shattered, and then the road is ahead of you and you can continue. So really I see this card not only as the tool card, but also a little bit of what is coming up after the High Priestess, or what the potential is in terms of what that tool can bring you. And I think part of the tool is understanding the power of being receptive, the power of being patient. And in fact, I was reading a friend's wonderful Facebook post yesterday about the art of patience. And it really is an art. It really is. It doesn't sound like an art, just sitting there and waiting. But believe you me, with all of these other distractions and everything that you could be doing and everything that we try to do, being patient is an art form, and it is an active process. It is not just simply resignation. It's not checking out. Patience is active. And I think that there's something here about the being actively patient that then results in this idea of a shift. And if I look at the combination of power, you've got then the Queen of Wands and the High Priestess. Well, the High Priestess, being that archetype, is neither here nor there in the world. She's not fully here. For her, patience is not really the thing. She is simply a membrane, in a way, through which information comes through. But the Queen of Wands herself, in her lightest, highest form, because as a senior court card, she demonstrates the highest potential, has probably learnt the hard way what patience is. The King of Wands certainly has. In terms of going out and riding out as a knight and full of that fiery zeal and that energy, and realizing that it gets him quite far in terms of going out into the world, but it wouldn't necessarily get him very far in terms of the development of his own psyche, the development, dealing with failure, dealing with limitation, dealing with pain, all of those things that he quite possibly rode out into the world to try and solve in an outward manner. And the Queen of Wands also understands this. And because she has at her highest potential the idea of receptivity rather than outward sort of pointed assertiveness, even though she looks pretty assertive, what she has learnt is the real magic happens when we take our foot off the accelerator. And that doesn't actually even explain it as much as I want it to. The real magic happens when we let go and understand that we don't have to do quite as much as perhaps we thought we needed to do, that we are not always as in control of everything as we think we are, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that it goes back to the idea of not knowing, of humility, of understanding that there are forces at play that are bigger than us, that lie beyond our scope to understand and recognize. And that very often what we try and do is we try and pretend that we're much more in control, and we end up sort of spinning on the surface of things, rushing from one thing to the other, feeling like in some way that makes us have more agency, whereas in this case the agency card is about that receptive waiting. It is about understanding that sometimes we can experience victory and success and know that actually it's down to forces that were beyond our control up to a point. It is up to us to be patient. It is up to us to put in the certain amount of work to listen to these intuitive voices, to be able to work creatively with creative energy, to understand and know ourselves that when we have become inflated, to understand when it is that we have placed quite a large sense of our own importance on things, whereas actually the reality is that we may be an integral part of the process, but we may not be necessarily consciously spearheading the process. We may be a small, very significant cog in a far larger machine. And that is also the case in terms of our psyche and what we are aware of. So that there is a demonstration here that we don't always have to do things in order to get things done. That sometimes it's the not doing, it's taking the foot off the gas. Because if you look at this road and you had kept your foot on the gas, then you would have ended up sort of driving into the wall. The wall here is suggested that it is simply, there is another force that's removed it. It doesn't, to me, suggest that we have done that by actively pounding that wall down. It just doesn't. It's particularly because of that face and profile. There's almost like a wisdom behind it that is maybe where we have been beholden to someone else or other forces or other people, or there is a kind of a personification of a force that is much larger. That wall itself is personified as being in some way sentient. And by sentient, I mean that it was there for a reason and it is now removed for a reason, but it isn't because we took a pick to it and did that. And so that idea of receptiveness, of being able to rein in and just deal with the discomfort of not doing anything, that's the active part of patience. And those messages then from the High Priestess, that message is the thing I think that really causes that wall to crumble. It may just be an insight. Remember, this is wands energy, this is creative energy. This isn't necessarily a physical thing where you felt like you haven't progressed in your life, or you haven't been able to get that promotion or something like that. And it may be that too, but it will always have been accompanied internally with a sense of the resistance being removed in some way, that there is a breakthrough which may be subtle. Again, it doesn't have to be a massive breakthrough, and in fact, massive breakthroughs are rarely what they appear to be, but that the breakthrough is something where there is perhaps an easing of something, perhaps even more of an opening of a channel to one's own intuition or one's own creative force, that there is a greater amount of energy that is available to you. And remember that the Six of Wands, and I often talk about this in terms of the Waite-Smith deck, it's the six. It's not the end of the line, and that's suggested also by the road. This is a graduation. I often call it a kind of graduation ceremony. It's like you've gone and done something, and you've gone and you have prevailed, and it is a victory. And now it continues. Now the work continues. Now the journey continues in some way, because that waypoint has been reached. So there is very much the idea of libidinal creativity. There is very much a fiery aspect to this, but there is also the moon there, front and center of the reading, which is the theme. And I think it is about tempering that fire and understanding that sometimes true creativity is the waiting for something. It's knowing when to stop. What brings it up for me is the idea of sometimes when I used to do art at school, the surefire way of ruining one of the works that I was working on, whether it was a painting or some kind of batik or something, was not knowing when to stop. And I think that there is a very clearly here the idea of learning to know when to stop. And knowing when to stop is really part and parcel of creativity. Knowing when to stop before that wall so that something else takes over. Knowing when to stop in terms of doing, and rather just sit with that fiery potential and understand that the High Priestess has something to bring us, and it has something to bring you. But she works on her own schedule. She is not, again, she's not in this world. She is elsewhere. There is a schedule. There is a rhythm. It's lunar. The moon has its own rhythms. We can't do anything to impact that. The High Priestess is not concerned about us. She simply does what she does. And then it's up to us, instead of running around, in frustration or impatience, is to adopt that Queen of Wands stance, to really understand that power doesn't necessarily have to act all the time. I hope that's useful. Please send any questions or comments to me. You can email sarah@integratedtarot.com. If there is a comment section wherever you are listening to this, then by all means post there, and I will do my best to reply. Otherwise, I will see you when I see you next, whether that is next month or the month after that. But believe you me, I will do whatever I can to bring this out as regularly as possible. Until then, take good care. Bye.